Hello and welcome to our webinar. Now, today's session is called Guardians of Trust, Shielding Customers from Deepfakes and AI Fraud. So let's go into that a little bit first. Well, it's an era of rapidly advancing technology. Deepfakes and other advanced forms of fraud have emerged as real and genuine threats to businesses and to their customers too. So as this digital landscape evolves, the need for robust defences against these kind of malicious activities is more critical than ever, as we all know. So what can you expect in the next half an hour or so? Well, there's going to be questions like what the biggest fraud threats are right now. What do deepfakes look like in the real world? And how are they impacting businesses? Also, we'll be looking at how AI-driven authentication and verification solutions can enhance security and mitigate risks. And importantly, and finally, what preemptive strategies can businesses take to stay ahead of the evolving threat landscape? So we have an expert panel on this today where we'll explore those problems, the solutions, and we will look to the future as well. An awful lot to get through, and I certainly and thankfully don't have to do it alone, or else the next half an hour or 40 minutes would be an awful lot of me, and no one wants that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Becky Gross, who's Principal Software Product Manager at Mitek. And also joining us, we have Joseph Vaughan, a Compliance Risk Manager with more than 7 years of experience, most recently with US Bank, and a decade of experience in the industry. Hello to all of you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Neil.
Right, as I said, we have an awful lot to get to, so we'll get started. And I really want to divide the session up today into two fairly obvious parts. The first half, I really want to look at the problems and the issues that are facing the industry and look at a few examples. And then second half, that's when we'll push in to more of the solutions and the things people can really be doing to try and mitigate some of those problems. So that's the kind of narrative we're going to follow today. So we'll try and stick to that. So, well, let's start at the coalface. Let's see what things are like out there. Joseph, I'll start with you if I can. And where is fraud currently most prevalent? Where are you seeing it most in the customer journey? And also, what types of fraud are you mostly seeing?
Yeah, that's a great question. We talk about identity theft to start, and obviously in terms of deep fakes and various strategies that fraudsters have taken when it comes to identity theft. Identity theft as a whole is something that really stretches across various compliance disciplines. It's not just a matter of fraud. There's the cybersecurity element to it. There's the compliance element to it. Even the money laundering and the sanctions elements to it and everything else. But specifically from a fraud perspective, identity theft is obviously a concern for consumers as well as the enterprises, financial institutions, and the various actors that are involved in these things. So we have the typical identity theft, traditional identity theft we call it, that could be happening at the beginning of a customer relationship. It could be happening, again via the cyber element, digital payments and things like that. Man-in-the-middle attacks where there's an authentication concern. That's a prevalent issue that's being tackled right now in the industry. Then you have synthetic fraud, which is where you take individual pieces of identities and combine them and to create false identities. And so, yeah, it's a broad concern, and it can be something that affects a customer relationship from the beginning or even during the customer relationship, during typical activities, payments and things like that.
One thing I will ask, though, is how has that changed? How are things evolving? How have things changed, particularly in your time in the industry?
Yeah, it's interesting when you do if you do research that goes back to, say, the early 2000s. You talk about the evolution of digital payments, digital wallets, and things like that. You see in the early 2000s there was a major concern with consumers about trust and verification within the digital space. That's obviously evolved as we've seen. Customers are becoming more confident about the digital space. That's not necessarily because, of course it is because we've enhanced securities and things like that within the digital space. But there's a marketing element to that. There's a customer education element to that. But over time, we have seen an increase in that confidence. Unfortunately, that doesn't mitigate the actual attacks and things like that go on. Data being purchased and sold in the dark web, the various shadow markets that go on that are happening all over the place. So it's changed in the sense that customers have become more confident about authentication and verification. Unfortunately, it's also that these events continue to happen. These cyber events continue to happen. These identity thefts continue to happen from the actual theft itself to further down the line. You've got opening of credit and other adverse consumer activities and things like that that go on. But the change I've seen personally is in how we react within the financial services industry. So we accept in the industry that these things go on, that the data has been stolen, there has been theft out there, and so we do the very best we can. At least this is our intention, to do the very best we can to respond appropriately to these types of events. And we see the regulatory agencies, enacting certain expectations to that effect as well. How do you react? What's the turnaround time? How do you respond and further mitigate going forward to make sure it doesn't happen again? So I think that's the biggest change that I've seen.
Yeah, there's so much to that. There's so many angles we could approach that from. Just from the education side of things is one that scares me the most. I know I was in a shop a few days ago, and there was a booklet there for sale which was titled Internet Passwords. And inside, there was another note saying, this is a terrible idea, don't use this book. It was quite scary. But anyway, that's another subject and something to put on your Christmas list as a joke present, I'm sure. Becky, let's bring you into this. Mitek works with a huge number of banks globally. What kind of things are your clients seeing? Similar types of fraud?
Right. Exactly what Joseph was talking about. We've seen the same type of fraud for many years now, right? The presenting fake photos, fake images, fake documents to the camera. But what I think is really important, as what Joseph just mentioned, is what we're doing when we see this fraud. So our clients see this kind of fraud all the time. We accept that it's there, we accept it's coming, but we have a really large amount of data that we're analyzing daily to be able to add these layers on of detection. So when we're doing a customer onboarding verification process, we now have this data to know what fraudsters are doing, and we're able to detect that right at the beginning.
Because Joseph, I'll come back to you if I can. What type of impact does this type of identity fraud have on a bank? Because as Becky says there's so many different ways it plays out, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, from a financial institution's perspective, there's and I won't go too broadly into this because it can certainly take long past an hour. But even to Becky's point about the customer identification, the data elements that are involved in the onboarding of a customer. Typically within financial institutions, that particular part of the customer relationship is absolutely key from a compliance perspective. You're dealing with the anti-money laundering compliance regulations going back to '01 and the Patriot Act, the customer information program type requirements and things like that that require verification. And then, of course, you deal with identity theft rules and things like that related to onboarding customers and dealing with address changes and things like that. So the data element when it comes to that particular part of the customer relationship is absolutely key from a variety of angles, even from an economic sanctions perspective in terms of flagging and what's the term I'm looking for? Screening and things like that. So data like that comes into the bank at that point in the customer relationship goes into screening tools and things like that. So there's a wide variety of different tools that get involved when that data enters the bank.
Becky, you were describing a moment ago about the issue of presentation attacks that bad actors might use to try and trick an identity verification system into thinking it sees the right person, and that person is real. I find this both fascinating and terrifying at the same time.
Right. Yeah. So presentation attacks are when they take the device, the phone, and they are presenting a fake image to the camera. So you have altered photo and altered ID, but the camera is taking the picture. It's taking a live picture. What we're seeing now start is something called an injection attack, where The fraudsters are actually bypassing the camera. They're not taking a picture of these things. They're using digital images. So they're injecting the digital image into the camera. So now they can use things like these AI generated images. They don't have to print them out on a very, high quality printer to be able to fake the system. They can just get it into the system digitally instead. And that opens up a lot of different attack vectors. Joseph was talking about earlier, man in the middle. That's what we see most of in the injection attack side of things. So we have a number of things to try and detect those as well.
I think it's interesting too.
Sorry, Joseph.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt you. It's interesting too to build on that too. In any conversation about identity theft, and I think in fraud overall, when you talk about data, all of this sort of, we have changed the conversation of what makes an identity into a combination of data elements. And so, anytime you're considering a strategy to mitigate the risk that comes with these kinds of things, you have to think about ways in which that data can be manipulated, or ways in which the authentication of that data can be usurped. So when you think about the man-in-the-middle attacks, for instance, the expectation is that when I am, applying for credit or something like that digitally, there's this potential, whether the consumer is aware of it or not, that the information that they're passing, they think is going directly to whatever recipient they intend on sending. But in reality, it's being caught somewhere else. It's being taken. It might be abused at that point. It might be abused at a later point. So all of those kinds of things are going on because we're dealing with this environment of expanding data usage.
Because I remember as a consumer, I remember the first time I had to do one of those sort of live presentation shots. And I can remember being slightly surprised by it and actually feeling very safe. Almost like when you're at the checkout at a shop and you end up having to do an extra level of security, or you get the phone call from the bank, or you suddenly feel quite reassured that someone's checking up on you, that you don't normally spend $1,000 on whatever, and then suddenly it's picked up and they want to check and you actually appreciate it. But with these attacks on those presentations, is that something that's almost a hacking or a bad actor technology that's growing, that's getting more sophisticated?
Oh, it grows every day. Yeah. And so we have to stay ahead of it. I mean, it's growing into more complex manipulations also into the image pipeline. But we still see the old school. I mean, we see Photoshop, bad Photoshops. We see Post-it notes on IDs. I mean, we see all of the gamut here, not only the new sophisticated fraud techniques, but we see people. We've seen Mario, a cutout of cartoon Mario, just to test our system. So we see people testing our system too. We know that's what it is. But yeah, I mean, there's so many new things coming. Like Joseph said before, we accept it happens and we're ready to fix something as soon as it starts to become a behavior.
So I do want to get on to some more examples in a couple of moments, but if I just stay with the consumer side of things and going back to the joke I made about that book I saw in the shop, it is part of this battle, not just it's making sure there's education as well the other way for the consumers, because you can lock your front door and put every padlock you like on it, but if the back window is left open by the consumer, then there's a big problem. Does there need to be a role of educating the consumer at the same time?
I think there absolutely does. I think it's interesting too. This happens to be being recorded just past the some of the holidays in the U.S. Thanksgiving, which is obviously sort of the legend of Thanksgiving, is you just have to deal with all your family members talking about stupid nonsense that you can't really deal with, but you end up having to deal with anyway. So over the past few months, I've had some of these conversations, and they sound terrifying to everybody that I've talked to about what's going on out there. But I think education is key, because we're dealing with a not just a culture, but a consumer population that in a lot of ways can be defined as financially illiterate in various ways. But I think beyond that, and that's not necessarily an insult, that's more of a reality that is being addressed in various ways, including by financial industries or financial institutions. But another part of it is that they're in some ways illiterate to the fraud and to the potential the potential problems that can be associated with that. And evidence of that is in basic attacks like smishing or vishing or phishing, phishing. Those kinds of attacks are, they don't even necessarily have to be hugely sophisticated, although through business email compromise and things like that, they can be so sophisticated that they can trick actors like top level management teams and C-suite folks. So education, at least in my mind, and having been through various areas within the industry, is absolutely critical in how we discuss these issues with our consumer base.
And I think, Neil, to add on to that, a piece of education that I see a lot, in my family and friends, like Joseph was saying with the holidays, is people don't trust biometrics yet. And I think the biometrics piece of it, so being able to verify your account with your face, with your voice, is actually quite a bit safer and more secure than having a password, especially a password that you use on everything, or a PIN or something that someone can steal. So part of that customer awareness and education is teaching them about biometrics and how safe it really is.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point too. And again, I mentioned earlier in the webinar about research going back into the early 2000s. I mean, as you see these types of things evolve, trust and confidence is key in any of these sort of innovations. We are innovating within the financial services industry, and of course with Becky's groups as well and Becky's expertise as well. We are innovating because we know what we have to tackle and the types of strategies that fraudsters are using. But at the same time, these innovations, we have to be able to provide a level of trust to our consumers. Our consumers have to believe these innovations are not only necessary, but working the way that they should be working. And I think that's really part of how we invest in these innovations.
Mm-hmm. Becky, I do want to get on to some examples that I know you've got to show us in just a moment, but I'll do one more question before we get on to that.
Okay.
And that is whether, and you were both just sort of talking earlier about how high up these attacks can get and who can be tricked. Are we sometimes lulled into a false sense of security? We've got our password, our dual factor authentication, maybe a fingerprint scanner on our laptop. You almost feel very safe as it is, as if you've taken care of everything, you're sorted, and maybe your defenses aren't up as a business because you think you've got it sorted. Is that potentially a risk as well?
It is, and it's, I think, especially with the man in the middle piece. So it's more of for the business. If you're from the consumer side, as long as if your bank offers you a voice or face addition for your security, then take it. It's from the customer or from the bank's point of view. As long as they have all of their avenues secured, and that's the piece that is really challenging that Joseph was talking about. Your data goes so many places. You have to know where those API calls are going, make sure everything is secure so that you can't experience these man-in-the-middle attacks. And then have your vendor, a vendor like Mitek, make sure that they're detecting these things on the back end too.
Yeah, and I think it's a part of it too. I mean, going back to the conversation about what the consumer base looks like. I mean, there are some consumers out there that genuinely, through through sort of the political side of things and maybe the media influence, are genuinely just distrustful of the financial services industry or various major players within the industry or even regulatory authorities, and that can be a vulnerability as well. Again, going back to what we talk about with our friends and family, it's more of I sort of explain to people, if you are dealing with some of the major players in this industry, and I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you got to go to one of the top 7 banks or something like that domestically, but if you're dealing with, or even that's just the US, but this is, worldwide, but if you're dealing with with some of these larger players, their level of exposure is much, much higher. They are required by regulatory authorities as well as their stakeholders to put these types of things in place. And so to Becky's point, if they're offering these additional security measures and things like that, there's a reason for that. And it's a consumer is mitigating fraud just as an entity is mitigating fraud, and you're never going to do it 100%. But there's these various tools that you can use from a consumer or entity side that can help mitigate that. And I think that's part of the education piece.
Well, before we move on to some of the solutions and things that organizations can do, Becky, I did ask you before we got stuck into the webinar today if you could provide some examples for us. What have you brought for us today?
Yeah, so just to start on the screen, you can see a couple of different things. And the reason why I brought these two is if you look on the right, I have blocked out her face, but that's a really kind of rudimentary Photoshop digital manipulation that you can see. If you look, her head isn't pointy, but they have done something where they're doing copy and paste, or, you can kind of see the edges. You can see that. And they left that in there when they put that through the system. We can look at it and see that it's a digitally manipulated image. What we have nowadays also, that was just something very recent, so we do still see those. But we have images like on the left, and that you can't really tell by looking at it. So this is an image that comes from thispersondoesnotexist.com. You can just continually reload that page and get all sorts of people. So
that's a person who does not exist.
This is a person who does not exist, yes. And we have started to see some of these things. And like I said earlier, as you have the data and you can start to see things becoming a behavior, then you can on the back end start to implement things to catch them. But if you have this, you do refreshing, you get this image, and you have this guy looking at the camera, it's a perfect image for an ID. You could create all sorts of documents from it. I think what's more interesting and more scary probably within the Gen AI world is it used to be that these digital manipulations were kind of only accessible to people who knew how to use Photoshop, who knew how to do these things. And nowadays, it's become accessible to all of us, to anyone who knows how to just use Gen AI. So you can come in, this example is this woman on the bottom, just tell your Gen AI, please put this face into this driver's license. And now you have it. This is something that anybody has access to and can do. And so that's probably what we are seeing as more of a threat, is just the accessibility of these tools to people. And we can detect these things, but it's just becoming a little more prevalent because of that accessibility piece.
I knew at the start of this webinar there would be several things that scared me, and that is definitely on the list because that is, if you put the two next to each other, if you didn't know to the human eye, a passing glance, you probably would not know. That is definitely concerning.
Yeah, and when you deal with, if you're considering, the mitigation element here, or the identification rather of an attack or exploitation like this, if you apply technology, AI tools, and things like that, which we see that the AI tools and AI, of course, is a much, much broader topic, but these technological tools that are being used by fraudsters to develop these types of images, if you then apply technology to try to identify them, there can be a lot of concerns with using the technology element because, again, it's coming down to identity being ones and zeros. Identity is now data, and so if you found a way to exploit data, then you can find a way to exploit digital identity. So it almost kind of points back to the human intelligence element. And there's a debate obviously out there that goes on and on and on about the value of human intelligence within your, detection and deterrence routines versus the value of technology. Human intelligence can fail in just the same ways in which technology can fail, and even in worse ways. So it's a very complex, myriad of challenges that we're facing from a mitigation perspective because of this sort of transition from identity to data and this sort of mix of the two.
So I'm sure, Joseph, around the table over the holidays, you could frighten plenty of your family about how many times their data is sold before people have finished their starters. But did any looking at these kind of things frighten you as someone who's worked in the industry for a decade?
It's if you work in fraud, my wife always makes the joke that fraud was the worst industry for me to get into because I'm already a generally pessimistic person to begin with, and fraud does not help in that at all. I think one sort of optimistic perspective that you can take is, entities benefit from protecting their consumers, especially when you're dealing with entities with a value proposition that ultimately is about, providing services to their consumers. So, if you're an entity that literally their value proposition is defrauding people, then sure, this is going to help you out. But there's a market sort of equilibrium conversation here. The financial institutions know that it benefits them, the institution itself, the stakeholders within the institution, as well as their customer base and everybody else, to put protections in place around this. So we're yes, in the fraud space, we're typically doing the chasing. We're chasing these new and developing ways in which to defraud people. But one thing I would tell really anybody is we're not going to stop that chase. There's an element to fraud. I call it fraud can't forget. So in terms of fraud mitigation, you can't forget past fraud schemes. You've got to continue to build on various schemes. Because if you forget check fraud, it's just going to continue to happen. We see check fraud happening all the time. With rudimentary check fraud continues to happen. So what do we do to provide opportunities to mitigate that to our consumers? We do that all the time. So I think that's one optimistic element, is that we're going to continue that chase.
Well, Joseph, you've set it up quite nicely for the second half of the webinar, and that's when we're talking about solutions. This is the chasing and the catching. We're not just chasing, we're catching as well, and hopefully getting ahead at times.
Right.
So, Becky, I'll come to you to start with on this one. You guys are solutions providers. Now, it must be such a constant challenge to stay ahead of the fraudsters because the speed of progress is so fast from their point of view. What types of sort of AI-driven solutions are Mitek offering? What kind of things are on the market at the moment?
Yeah, I think what's really important, we've talked about this a little bit, is having different layers. So biometrics is what we're really focusing on now, but part of biometrics is, we said this earlier, is the liveness piece. So is this a live person taking an image? Both that and does this person really exist? Like we just talked about. That's kind of where the biometrics and matching with your ID comes in, is does this person exist? And then we have all these layers of liveness at the front, at the back. Is this a real person in front of the camera? And the solutions are all built into that, right? So it's looking at the pixels like you saw earlier with the face morph. Are the pixels different in the face? Are they different lighting? Different things like that. So those are the kinds of things that we're adding on. And like Joseph just said, you have to just keep going. And that's the optimistic thing. So we just keep adding layers. Right. So if we have a liveness, we have liveness for the document, we have liveness for the face, we have liveness for the voices. And then we'll just keep on adding to those liveness algorithms as we detect more things.
Yeah, as you said, Joseph, fraud doesn't forget. That's definitely something that's needed to be put on a mug or a T-shirt. Maybe we can do some branded merchandise after this webinar.
I like it.
Let's branch out a little bit. But Joseph, does protecting digital identities stop at onboarding, I suppose, or does it continue for you?
It's certainly not. It certainly doesn't stop at onboarding. There are various activities that obviously happen within the customer lifecycle that we have to deal with. There's the, if you tie opening up your mobile app to facial recognition and things like that, or you tie authentication to fund transfers and things like that. Mm-hmm. The protection of identity certainly doesn't stop there. There are, throughout the entire process of in various complexities of customer relationships, rather, there are areas where we focus within the financial services industry to continue to protect the identity.
Because Becky, one thing I was really keen to talk to you about is whether those same types of solutions used at onboarding, where obviously there is so much extra security and extra focus and attention? Can that help further downstream as well?
Absolutely. So at the front, usually what you do with onboarding is you're proving that person does exist and this is a live picture. Once you've proven that, you can do the things that Joseph is talking about. So let's say later down the line in your app, if they're doing a transfer over $1,000 or changing their PIN or something that's really important, maybe you have to do another biometrics check. And that would be just doing a face-to-face match or voice-to-voice match, making sure that they are who they say they are. Since they've already proven who they are at the beginning on onboarding, they don't have to do that identity verification again, just a re-verification of themselves. And you can use that at any point. We see that in banks. We see that being used in gaming systems, in marketplace, anywhere where you want to kind of re-verify who you are.
One thing that really fascinates me, and we've touched on it briefly about staying ahead of the pace of change. For the people who work on the technical side of this and actually come up with the solutions and identify the threats, I often imagine it like as a boat that might have sprung a leak, and that one's being covered, and that one's being covered, and that one's being covered. How do you go about identifying the real trending new threats that are coming through and actually starting to work on the most important ones? That's something that's always fascinated me about how you prioritize which threats to target.
That's and I'll start with the education point, and then we start talking about prioritization. Prioritization is absolutely key, and the triage, so to speak, of various fraud events and things like that. Education within the fraud industry is key. I mean, we have various certifications and things like that, but I think it goes beyond just being certified and dealing with continuing education and all that. I think it's partnerships and communities and knowledge sharing routines and things like that. There are. And there's an expansion of this idea of knowledge sharing that goes to the regulatory level. There's safe harbor laws and things like that for financial institutions. They're sharing information. So, not even going there, just staying in this area of sort of the community of experts. We financial institutions commonly share typologies and strategies and things like that without getting into the proprietary. They share those types of things and then go extrapolate from there. You've got geographies, countries, nationality, or nations that are sharing this kind of information. You've got international institutions that share typologies and things like that. So that I think is sort of the base level, is staying educated and staying in tune, having your fraud programs within your financial institution, staying in tune via certain experts. Their responsibility is to stay in tune. So I think that's base. I think that's the absolute base level of keeping up with the trends.
Yeah. And as a product manager trying to decide what to work on next, that prioritization is a key, right? And so we use all the data that comes in as a leader. So if you will remember that this person does not exist person. And when we saw one of those, that's just one incident. When we started to see a lot of those, that becomes a behavior, and that's something that now bubbles up to the top of the priority list. And that's kind of what we do. If you think of it as your boat example, there's a lot of little tiny leaks around. Which one do you chase after? Once that one leak kind of starts to become bigger, then that's the one that we take.
Yeah, I know that wasn't the most technical of examples, but thank you for running
That
with
makes
and humoring
sense,
with me.
Well, and I'll add on to that too, and I'll do it briefly. I mean, in a lot of different disciplines, financial crimes disciplines, we talk about the risk-based approach, the RBA. I don't know that too many people use the acronym, but it is a very commonly addressed perspective. And I won't be sharing too many of my research, genre ideas, but I think it'd be really interesting to dig into how we address this risk in various disciplines, because you've got on one end of the spectrum, you've got the sanctions, economic sanctions, which is going to be very, very, very low, if not absolute zero tolerance for abuses of economic sanctions routines, all the way to sort of that fraud where it's an operational risk, where it comes down to identifying the most exploited, the greatest vulnerability risk out there, and then maybe not focusing so much on those lower or those lighter vulnerabilities and things. Approaching it from that perspective is common within the industry.
Yeah, I think the RBA example was better than my boat analogy. So we'll go with yours, Joseph. It was slightly better. We'll take that one. I won't be precious about it.
Change in conceptualization, that's all.
Plenty of questions have been coming in through all of this. Any that we don't get through on the chat, we'll try to make sure are answered afterwards. But I'll just run through a few of the key sort of themes of questions that have come in. I'll just go to this one first about how people can go about finding gaps in security, because I guess any organization, however good they think their security is, I guess it has to be stress tested, it has to be abused, it has to be pushed. You almost want to find a hole in it so you can fix it. What would be our advice about starting that process?
Well, I can go first, and then maybe Joseph, if you can touch on how you guys have done it in your companies. But really exactly that, Neil, is we encourage people to test the system with our SDKs and APIs in place. So we will do that, but we want them to trust themselves and use their own team to try and get through. So just really, really stress testing it, making sure that you can get through, and test us. Test your vendor. So send through the Marios, send through the poorly photoshopped images, send those through and see what happens, and make sure that they're being caught, those easy ones that we know we're going to see.
Yeah, and I think from within the financial institutions, obviously, so I've worked at two of the major financial institutions here in the U.S. One of them is a predominantly domestic-based bank. The other was more international. But we're talking about fairly sizable organizations, and there's various fraud strategy teams and fraud risk management teams and different groups like that. And so they're trying to find these synergies, and they're trying to find how they manage these relationships. I think from a financial services industry or financial institution perspective, having the right teams and the team structure, the appropriate team structure to take advantage of efficiencies and things like that in terms of identifying, not just identifying the typologies, but how they affect your financial institution and your consumers in particular. But I think a lot of financial institutions do take advantage of various consulting organizations and third-party resources that can take a perspective beyond just one institution or even an industry and start approaching it from a different angle. So I think that the financial institutions will deal with these types of things in different ways, not just internally, but also taking advantage of external knowledge sharing groups as well.
We are starting to run out of time a little bit, so I've got a few other key themes I want to cover off, and if we could try and keep the answers fairly short and sweet, I'd be terribly grateful to both of you.
He's talking to me, Becky. He's talking to me.
I absolutely was not. That was more to me going on about leaking boats and talking about internet books in the shop. That's my fault. I've been padding too much. One thing that has come up is a theme that we haven't covered is customer experience, because we have to remember that anything that we put in place, real people, real organizations, they have to go through that process and use all of these different technologies to keep themselves safe. But how do we balance both security with that customer experience? What are our thoughts on that?
That's a tough one, because you're dealing, the customer experience, not just the customer experience of dealing with the ways in which you're trying to mitigate fraud, which is one element, but also the customer experience in case a fraudulent or an attack occurs, and how a financial institution deals with that and how they communicate with their client. I mean, those are really, really important conversations. And sometimes you do have to make decisions as an institution, not just because you're looking further ahead about what can happen from a fraud perspective, but also because you're dealing with regulatory requirements and things like that. Every once in a while, not every once in a while, but sometimes you do have to put measures in place that are going to be a little bit more of a sticky situation with your consumers. That's where the education piece comes in. Other times you can listen and engage those customers and say, what do you think about this? Are there ways in which maybe you would use this differently, and then we can absorb that and take that in. But there's a lot of different factors involved here.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the people who are using these systems are 16-year-olds up to 90-year-olds.
Mhm.
So when we're using our UX designers and we're talking about UX, it's really hard to narrow in on something that these young guys are really used to taking selfies and putting themselves in front of the camera compared to, my dad who has to have his glasses on and doesn't know how to put the camera in front of himself. So it's hard, but it is something that we think about almost daily is the customer experience because if we can't get this to be something that is really easy and fast to use, then people aren't going to use it. And we want people to start using this. We want that, like Joseph has been saying, our identity is data these days. We want our identity to shift back over to who we are, who our face is. And we need people to be able to use the systems in order to do that.
There's two more questions, two more things I want to get through. If you are both still okay for time, I do
Mhm.
appreciate your time today.
We're
So
on
I did want to
holiday,
get
remember, Neil?
exactly. That's what I remembered. Can we bring up bias? Because this is a
Mm.
difficult point and one that I think is really important that we explore very, very briefly. How can organizations make sure that particularly any AI-driven verification processes remain unbiased? I know it's a difficult subject, but I think it's something we need to discuss quickly.
Oh,
Isn't
it's
it all?
super
No,
important.
go ahead,
Yeah.
Becky.
Yeah, I think especially in the days of, I mean, we all probably watched Coded Bias or saw it on Netflix, how there is an inherent bias, or there was on face compares, and when it first came out. What you should do now, we are all of us vendors are extremely sensitive to this because of the reporting that has been done. Ask your vendor what their data set looks like. So you should have a really good spread of geographical content, geographical faces from all around the world. You should have um, multiple, male and female of from these different geographic origins, and then you should have a lot of different ages. So they should have that that data set content that, and then compare the difference in different regions and see where you're going to be if you're going to be out in all the regions of the world. Look at all of the different data there. That's available to you, and it should be something that you keep an eye on because it's something that we all are keeping an eye on ourselves.
Yeah, I think and bias is a problem we created. It's a
Yeah.
human problem. So, or can we rely on technology to solve a human problem? Very unlikely. This is where the human intelligence element comes in, and the human intelligence element, of course, could continue to enhance those biases, or through honesty, transparency, discussions and things like that, we can continue to try to tackle that. But I mean, it's an issue that just very briefly, I mean, even when you look at some recent research on ChatGPT, you apply the human element to ChatGPT, and it's evolving. It's literally becoming quote unquote dumber and dumber. It's becoming so it's interesting how when you apply that human's piece to the technology, the actual impact to it. But it's not something we can avoid. It's something we need to address, and we need to tackle head on.
Yeah, I think that human impact there on ChatGPT came from when my son discovered it and started asking it all kinds of questions that I will not go into now because it's not suitable for any kind of audience. One final question, which I'd freely say is from me, and I always like to make sure when I host any of these sessions that people have something to take away they can do differently. It's all well and good us discussing the issues, discussing some of the problems. It's nice to know what people can do differently after watching this to make a tangible difference to the way they operate. For you, for everyone watching this today, and I'll start with you, Becky, if I can, what should people do differently? What would you like them to consider and approach differently after watching this today?
Yeah, I think that really what they should do is start to use biometrics more. So even if you don't quite trust it as 100%, know that we are as vendors really focusing on that and we have really good fraud detection and start using it and get used to that. That's kind of where everything's going. So like I said earlier, if your financial institution offers you to use a face as a verification, take it, try it, see how it goes, give them feedback. Um, don't just give up if it's hard the first time. Keep trying, because this is kind of the way we're moving forward.
Yeah, and
I'll give
I'll
you the
leave.
last word.
Yeah, I'll leave with and I'll actually use one word and then extrapolate on that. There's a term we use in fraud constantly, and that is vulnerability. I think if there was one thing that you could consider as a consumer or even as an entity, identify your vulnerabilities. When we when we talk about staying informed, this is something where you need to be aware of what's going on. You don't need to be, an expert like, Becky and I, but you need to be aware of what's going on. This is not something you can stick your head in the sand on. Be aware of the types of things that are going on and then how that affects you, how that relates to the vulnerabilities perhaps that you've identified within yourself or maybe within your family or within your friends or anything like that.
It's a very good place to finish. Joseph, Becky, thank you very, very much indeed. You've been so generous with your time. I appreciate we've run over slightly. And if there aren't any themes or questions that we couldn't get to in the chat, we'll try and pick those questions up individually afterwards. So my thanks to both of you. The recording of this webinar will be available shortly, so you can come back and watch it again or share it as you see fit. A huge thank you to both of our speakers today and to you for watching. Bye for now.